People who were in comas, what shocked you when you woke up? In the 90s, my great-grandpa had a stroke. He was in a coma for 3 weeks. When he woke up, he'd forgotten how to speak English. He could only speak Choctaw. He learned it as a kid because his family lived near the Choctaw Reservation. He played with lots of local kids. He was fluent then, but forgot it over his lifetime. By that time, he couldn't remember a single word. This lasted about 10 days, and then he woke from a nightmare and suddenly could only speak English again without remembering any Choctaw. He could also repeat every conversation that happened in his room while he was in the coma. Wow, brains are amazing things. If I'm not mistaken, there's a guy who started speaking Cantonese after a coma and ended up with a Chinese woman. I was in a coma for 4 days. When I woke up, everyone was talking about my baby. I had lost my long-term memory and didn't even remember being pregnant. My son is in the neonatal intensive care unit at the Children's Hospital. I delivered him by C-section at 29 weeks. This was all related to Crohn's disease. I found out about it after I regained consciousness. During my pregnancy, my colon had ruptured. My husband said I spoke like a child when I first came to. When I woke up, I felt exhausted and remained anxious for the next few days. I recalled a conversation between my mom and a nurse while I was out. A couple of days later, my long-term memory returned and I remembered everything. About everything up to my second surgery. My son was born during the third operation. Surprisingly, my son was, well, everything's fine with your son. Yes, he weighed 1.474 kilograms, and now he's 18 and 195 centimeters tall. Thanks for asking. I was in a coma for 9 days. When I woke up, I was still on a ventilator. When they took me off it, my body forgot how to breathe on its own. I literally had to relearn how to do it. It took me I had no natural sense of how to breathe. How long or deep to inhale, hold, and exhale. I had to focus all my concentration on breathing. It was really creepy. For those wondering how I slept, I didn't for the first couple days. If I dozed off, my oxygen sensor would beep and wake me. Then the nurse would yell across the ICU for me to keep breathing. I couldn't speak due to tubes in my nose and throat, but I remember once waking up exhausted to that damn beeping. Anyway, I started focusing on breathing again, but it really annoyed me. My nurse rushed over and yelled at me to breathe. I looked at her and silently mouthed, "Yes, I'm breathing." She must have read my lips and sensed my frustration because she just threw up her hands and said, okay, good job," then left. Well, I shared this because I've never had such an opportunity before. My ability to breathe normally returned after about a month. My health is fine now, so I wouldn't say it had any lasting effect on me. Well, thanks. Now I'm conscious of every breath I take. Don't forget to blink, jerk. You've ruined the next 30 minutes of my life. My mom was in an induced coma for 3 months. When she woke up, she thought the hospital was trying to kill her. She tried to get out of bed and fell because she couldn't walk. She was mostly scared that her legs had lost their shape. She had to relearn how to control each muscle. She couldn't speak properly and had forgotten how to write. After relearning, her handwriting was completely different. She said that her hands looked perfect, nails pristine from disuse. Combing her hair after waking, most fell out. She nearly died daily in the coma, got sepsis after diverticulitis and a botched surgery. Hair regrew, she walks, but brain damage makes her seem drunk and dizzy. Her 5-year recovery is miraculous. A close family friend was in a coma for 6 months. When he woke, he was shocked by how old his wife looked. He'd actually lost the last 15 years of memories. He knew he had 2 kids, but as babies, and didn't know about his third. His memory never came back. He jumped from no cell phones to smartphones and laptops. Everything was new to him. Stuck in the early 90s, but in the 2000s he had a lot to learn. Missing his kids growing up was the hardest for him. It's the saddest story I've seen here. God, it's awful. Did he feel it was punishment for something terrible? My wife was in a medically induced coma for 2 weeks. When she woke up, she had false memories based on conversations in her room. For instance, she thought she had flown to Washington for treatment. While she was comatose, my dad mentioned he just got back from a business trip to Washington. Somehow she heard this while unconscious, and her brain interpreted it as her flying to Washington. Even after we explained reality, it took days for her to accept it. My brother-in-law had a brain tumor and was out when first hospitalized. The nurses were Asian, so upon waking, he apologized for making people come to Japan to see him. My stepdad was comatose for about 3 weeks. When he woke up, he couldn't find his teeth. We totally forgot where we put them. Searched for a whole week. Suddenly, he collapsed by the hospital sink out of nowhere. They revived him, but couldn't figure out why he could barely breathe. Then the doctors sat him on. They showed X-ray images with dentures inside. They forgot to remove them before inserting the tubes in his mouth, which resulted in blocked air access or something like that. So yes, we found them, changed. Since it sparked a lot of interest, I decided to post a photo, the only one I have on an old mobile phone. Hope the link works. Here's the photo. Oh, don't tell me I haven't seen a BlackBerry in so many years. I was in a coma for 4 days due to bacterial meningitis. When I woke up, I was completely deaf. I had to communicate with my parents, doctors with a notebook and a pen. Somehow, gradually, my hearing came back in my left ear, but my right ear is still completely deaf. Hey, anyone else had bacterial meningitis? I'm so glad you survived. Trust me, it could have been much worse. Thanks, man. I'm glad I made it too. The doctors gave me a 10% chance to live. Glad you made it too. Changed. Talked to my mother. She told me the doctors only gave me a 5% chance of survival. Your mother, my wife, was in a medically induced coma. Dad reacted to contrast dye after head trauma. He had seizures like his brain rebooted. He could only speak like a little girl. My sister had just been born then. He couldn't hold or grab things. He spent months in therapy. Eventually, his mood changed. He became irritable, impatient, and very drowsy. He's fine now, except for some neck pain. About 20 years ago, my cousin had a serious head injury from a fall. He was around 20 years old then. He was in a coma for almost 4 weeks. When he woke up, he quickly discovered he had an eidetic memory. He could repeat conversations verbatim and recall when things were said. He could also memorize images in seconds. His memory is still eidetic. It's unbelievable. Irritates whenever he reminds me of something I've said in the past, usually something I can't even remember. I suggest slamming him on the head one more time. Looking at what happened the last time he got hit on the head, he'll probably just get another superpower. Better not to take any chances trying to fix him. No, it just doesn't work correctly. You need to turn it off and turn it back on. DK, diabetic ketoacidosis, sent me into a coma. I have vague memories of how I was sick. The general sense of time was just like porridge. Even years later, I can't establish correct timeline. I have flashbacks of different doctors coming in and out of the room. As soon as I came out of the coma, I was still out of my mind. When you're on an insulin drip, doctors check your sugar every hour. I could never fall asleep, but all this time I felt like I was asleep. It is difficult to describe this feeling, just a cat-like dragging time. I was in a coma for almost 6 weeks. When I woke up, I had to learn everything again. I still had most of my speech abilities, but my motor skills were terrible. I had to learn how to wipe ass, as well as how to climb up and down the stairs. It took about 3 weeks. I also lost a ton of shit. I was 190 centimeters tall and weighed about 65 kilograms.